Hi, this is Daniel. In this video, I'm going to talk all about manual exposure. I believe that this technique will improve the quality of your photos. It'll give you the control you've been looking for. Let's start by answering the three basic questions: what, why, and how. So what? What is manual exposure? Manual exposure is a mode you can shoot in using the mode dial on the top of your camera to give you complete control over the three attributes that create every single photo. Interesting thing to realize is that all cameras work the same. Whether it's a $4,000 mirrorless camera that just came out last week, or it's a camera from 1950s that shoots in film. They all use three basic principles to create a photo. And my goal is that by the end of this video, you'll have a well-rounded understanding of these three different aspects and how to use them for different types of photography. Next is the why question. Why do we use manual exposure when we do photography? Now, manual exposure is mostly used by professionals, of course, but it is not limited to the professional world. It is used by hobbyists who want to take advantage of their camera. You spend good money on a camera, on a lens and accessories and software, and you want to be able to control it the way you want to control it, and manual exposure is the biggest step in that direction. Now, there are other modes to shoot in on your camera. There's also shutter priority and aperture priority and a bunch of other little modes that do specific things. And from the looks of it, it makes our life easier. But in my opinion, it's a good idea to move past those modes and jump into the manual world so that you can take control of what your camera is doing. You can stop letting your camera think for you, and you can start thinking for it and creating photos more purposefully, and you'll also be able to tackle challenging lighting conditions much more efficiently. Now, before we get to the how, which is what most of this video is going to consist of, let's talk about one word in particular: exposure. What does exposure mean? How do we use it to our advantage? Now, exposure can mean a few different things depending on the context. For example, someone may say a photo is overexposed or underexposed. That simply means, in their opinion, which is subjective, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, they're saying that they believe that photo is too dark or too bright. So underexposed means, in their opinion, too dark. Overexposed means too bright. So with that being said, exposure is simply the act of light gathering onto your sensor, or in terms of film, gathering onto your film. And as light gathers there, it builds up an image. If light is only exposed onto your sensor for a fraction of a second, it may be a darker photo compared to if you were to expose light onto your sensor for a longer amount of time, because that same image is still coming through your lens and is building up more and more light, building a brighter image. Now, that is basically shutter speed. We'll get to that in a minute. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm getting a little excited here because I love this stuff. But exposure is light coming through your lens into your camera sensor or film and creating an image. Our goal with photography is to have a good exposure, or an even exposure, which means the photo as a whole is not too dark, is not too bright. Now, when things come into the picture like a bright sky or dark shadow areas, things can get tricky because we cannot always capture detail in the darkest area while also maintaining detail in the brightest area, such as a sky. And sometimes we have to compromise. And I've said before, photography is the art of compromise. You'll understand by the end of this video what that means, because we often find ourselves in tricky situations where we can only expose for a nice blue, nice sunset sky, or shadows on our subject if we're shooting someone with the sun behind them, and then we don't want them to be a black silhouette. So we have to pick what's most important in our photo, and we will expose for that. So you can expose for the skin tones. In other words, you set your exposure, your brightness amount, to where the skin looks good. Now, the sky as a result may be blown out, which is overexposed and white. There's no detail left in the sky area of your photo, and we just have to be okay with that to a certain point. Yes, we can fix some stuff in editing, we can enhance things, and we can recover things in editing, in post, in the editing stage, but generally we want to get the best exposure possible in camera, right? We don't want to be lazy and say, well, I'll fix it in post, I'll fix this in Photoshop, I'll fix it in Lightroom later, I'm not going to worry about the details now. Well, let's worry about a little bit of those details when we're actually photographing so that we'll save ourselves time later and we'll develop those better skills and habits of getting a good exposure in camera. Now, what about when you're shooting in a low light environment, such as a wedding venue or the altar area of a church, or just at nighttime when the sun is already set and you only have maybe some outside lighting or just natural light to rely on? What do you do when there's just not a lot of light there? Well, that's where the compromise comes in. You'll have to be adjusting your settings accordingly to get light into your camera one way or another. And when you run out of available light, then you're kind of in what I call the danger zone, where you're having to compromise one of your three settings, whether you're compromising on your shutter speed, you're compromising your ISO, or your f-stop. ISO is one of the biggest ones that people play with when we don't have a lot of light, because ISO will increase the brightness of your entire photo kind of all together. It amps it up. But what also happens as a result of that, the negative of that is, we fixed our brightness of our photo, but now we have a lot of grain in our photo. We can also play with our shutter speed. Instead of using ISO, what if we change our shutter speed to get a better exposure, more light into our camera? We can shoot with a slower or a longer shutter. A longer exposure means more light, right? Well, if we get too long, things will now get blurry if they are moving in our scene. If we are taking pictures of people, or if we're doing handheld photography, which I always do, then there's going to be some blur if your shutter is open for too long. And that's the downside of that. Yes, you got more light, but now you may have motion blur or a camera shake or your subjects are moving. There's always the downside to fixes. Well, not always, but there is when you just don't have a lot of light. You got to compromise somewhere. And we'll talk about that more in detail later when we go through each of these three settings and I explain what they do and how they work and how you can use them to your advantage. All right, here we are. This is the reason why you're watching this video, is because the next three portions, we're going to talk about what the shutter speed is, what the f-stop does, and what ISO means. Okay, so let's start with the first one, shutter speed. Shutter speed is a setting in your camera that refers to how long your sensor is exposed to light. I can take a 1 second picture. It sounds kind of weird when you think of it like that, but that's what it is. If I set my shutter speed to 1 second, it's going to click open, and for a whole solid second, it's going to be soaking in light through the lens, soak it in until that second is over, then click, the photo is done. And the curtains, which are little moving shutters, there's actually two shutters that cover your sensor, they're going to close or open when the photo starts. So you can set how long your sensor is exposed to light with the shutter speed. And it's kind of a misnomer. It shouldn't really be called shutter speed. It should be called exposure time. But don't worry, I'm not going to try to reinvent the wheel here or make a revolution in the photography world, but it's just a personal soapbox I like to stand on to say, hey, shutter speed is not really what's going on. It's not the speed of your shutter. It's the duration or the length of time that your sensor is exposed to light. So you can think of it as exposure time or shutter speed. They're really the same thing. Just one's a little more accurate than the other. Now, because shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second, you'll see it displayed as fractions on your camera. And you will see them on the left, there'll be longer durations of time. When you scroll to the left on your shutter speed, and when you go to the right, you'll get faster and faster or smaller fractions. Remember the old pi analogy in school? Going back to 5th grade, are you smarter than a 5th grader? Fractions are parts of a pie, right? So if we have a tiny little sliver of a pie, say 1,000th of a pie slice, or a slice that is 1,000th of a whole pie, very small slice. 1/2 a pie, very large chunk of pie. You're going to have a tummy ache after that one. So shutter speed is measured just like that, fractions of a second. You can do 1 second, you can do 30 seconds. You can do 4,000th of a second, which is very fast, although we usually shoot kind of in the middle range, which is, I would say, 1/60th of a second, up to about 1/500th of a second is the most common shutter speed ranges within there. Now you do need to start thinking of things linearly, which means on a line, just like the number line, going back to elementary school, we got 0 up to 10, right? Or if you're getting -10 to 0 to 10. And that's how you want to think of really all these settings, but shutter speed as well, because it is a numerical value that decreases and increases linearly. And it's, for me, as a visual learner, easy to see that from left to right. And as you scroll in your settings on your screen in your camera, you'll see that left is the longer shutter speeds, which is brighter, right? More exposure. Right is darker or faster shutter speeds because there's less light. There's less chance for that light to build a photo on your sensor, so your photo is going to be darker. But here's the pro. You may be getting a darker photo when you're speeding up your shutter speed, but you're also getting less motion blur. You can freeze the motion, as we say, with a very fast shutter speed. So let's pretend we're at a race. We've got cars zooming by us going, 100 miles per hour. Now, I have not personally shot a race like that, so I'm just doing this hypothetically to give you an example. But if we were to use a relatively slow shutter speed, such as 1/60th of a second, which would probably be okay for people portraits, but for a speeding car, it's just going to be a big old blur right in front of you, especially if you're up close to it. It's going to move, I don't know what the math is, let's say 50 feet in the span of 1 second. I know my math is probably weird. So it covers distance over time, and our shutter speed is open for a portion of that time. It's going to be capturing a moving car while the shutter's open and gathering in light. The problem is the light is moving and the car is moving, so we get motion blur. We have a very blurry, probably undesirable photo. Maybe that's what you're going for, I don't know. Maybe it's a cool thing. But we need to be sure that the motion of our subject, which is whatever's in front of us, a kid, a family, a church service, an event, a wedding, a car, the motion of that thing in front of us matches or at least can be captured properly with our shutter speed setting. So if we don't want a blurry, fast-moving car in front of us, we want it to be frozen and still. Obviously we know it's driving fast, but we want the photo to be clear and sharp. We need a very fast shutter speed. So again, I've never done this before personally, but I would suggest at least shooting at 1/2000th of a second, possibly the next one up, which is faster, which is 1/4000th of a second. And most cameras these days can go that fast. So you need a fast shutter speed, tiny fraction of a second to capture fast-moving objects. Now, if you're shooting people that are not moving, such as a posing family or a model or a kid that can sit still, if you find one of those, let me know. Then you can use a slower shutter speed and get away with it. You can get more light that way, which is what you want. You always want the right amount of light, but you don't have to shoot crazy fast if your subject is not moving crazy fast. This is why you'll hear people commonly say online, you need to slow your shutter speed down, or you need to speed up your shutter speed. That just means that you need to, make it faster or slower to capture the motion more appropriately to what you're trying to get. Now, we all seen those beautiful photos of waterfalls. It's got this like nice, creamy, smooth blur to it, but nothing else is blurred. How do they do that? It's two things. They have the camera stationary, not moving on a tripod. That's the trick number one. And then second is they have a long shutter speed. So they set up the camera on a tripod, get the composition they want, they point it at the waterfall, and they usually try out a few different shutter speeds. They could do maybe 10 seconds of exposure or 4 seconds of exposure, and that will be gathering motion of that water or that creek or river moving for that amount of seconds or whatever your shutter speed is. And as long as the camera did move, everything else that's not moving, like the rocks and trees and things like that, they will be completely stationary and sharp. But the moving water or the moving people or the moving car or the moving children, they will be a really interesting blur. And that is a style that a lot of people go for, and that's how it's done. Long exposure photography is also used when taking pictures of planets, stars, nebulae, and nighttime scenes. Now, the problem with that is that because the Earth is actually moving through space, it's rotating and moving around the sun, if you take too long of an exposure, you'll get star trails because the star is a point of light that is relatively moving. It's actually not moving. We're moving through it or away from it. And our camera, which is mounted to the Earth, is moving through space. So it's dragging that light across the sensor, creating star trails as the Earth orbits and rotates. And that is how long exposure works. I guess the opposite of long exposure photography would be high-speed photography, which would be, again, race cars, even athletes, and things like birds, hummingbirds, fast-moving animals, things like that. And that is all down to the shutter speed. The most common problem I get people write me about concerning photo quality is my photos are blurry, what's going on? And I ask them, tell me what the setting was on your camera for shutter speed. And they're like, well, it was 1/40th. Or 1/30th, isn't that okay? And I say, no, that's way too slow, way too long of amount of time to be capturing one portrait or one photo that's handheld with a moving subject. So you gotta at least start at 1/80th is what I suggest, or 1/125th is kind of like, I think is like my floor. I try not to go below that. I can, of course I can. I don't want to if I don't have to, right? That's kind of like my bottom line for shutter speed is 1/80th of a second. And then of course there's faster than that. But if I'm trying to get more light, I'll slow down my shutter speed and slow it down. But I sort of stop doing that around 1/80th of a second. And if I go slower than that, I need to really calm my nerves down and be shooting very slowly and controlled so that my hands are not causing any blur with those slower shutter speeds. All right, let's move on to the next setting that we can have control over in manual mode, which is the f-stop. Now, I personally tend to call it aperture because to me, I visualize what's actually happening in the lens as we change our f-stop value, which is the aperture, which is a mechanical piece inside your lens, is opening and closing. Remember the classic opening of the 007 films where it would be all black and then this circular door would open with all these moving blades and then 007's in the back, he turns and shoots and then I don't know if there's blood or it closes or whatever, but that is an aperture. It's a circular aperture, which is simply just like a mechanical sphincter that opens and closes. And it's a really ingenious invention, actually, how it can open and close while still maintaining a circle in the middle. Now, that is used inside of modern lenses to let in light or stop light from coming in, and it is completely controllable by your f-stop number. So f-stops would be f1.8, f2.8, f3.5, f4, f5.6, f11, f22. Now, what do these values mean? Well, they refer to the size. It's a complex fraction, but it is essentially the size of the opening in your aperture inside your lens. So let's think of this in terms of left to right, dark to bright, just like we did with the shutter speed. Remember, the left is in shutter speed is longer shutters and is a little brighter, but to the right is faster shutter speeds, but darker. There's a kind of bright to dark there going on. Aperture is the same thing. As we go to the left, we go to larger holes, larger openings in your lens, such as f1.8, f1.4, and even f1.2 for those really expensive lenses that are also really heavy, but they're really nice because f1.2 is a lot of light, and that's going to be a brighter photo. Now, as we stop down, which means you're cutting off light, we're fractionally getting darker and darker, we go to the right, which is the larger f-stop numbers. That's where it's kind of confusing. The hole is actually getting smaller, but the f-stop number is getting bigger. This is a weird relationship there on an X and Y chart that I don't even want to try to plot. But as we go higher in f-stop number, such as f22, that's like no one ever uses that for anything practical. Maybe taking pictures of the sun, that's about it. But as we go to those higher f-stop numbers, the hole, the aperture, right, the mechanical 007 thing is getting smaller. The hole is getting smaller and smaller down there. And that just means less light hitting our sensor. It doesn't mean that we're going to just see a circle of light on our picture, then everything else will be black around it. That's not what that is. But it all works together inside to let in less light or let in more light as we open that hole up larger. You may hear people saying things like, you need to stop down your exposure or stop down your aperture because it's too bright. That just means they telling you to use a different f-stop to let in less light, which would be, let's say, going from f3.5 to stopping down to f5.6. I know it's a larger number, but it actually means less light because the hole is smaller. You may also hear people say, I like to shoot wide open. That just means they like to shoot at f1.8, assuming their lens can get that bright. And they like that look. They like having a lot more light to play with. And they also like the effects that come as a result of shooting wide open, which we'll get to in a second. Every lens has its own aperture limitations, if you will. So if you get a cheaper lens, it cannot shoot very wide open, or such as f1.8, even f2.8. Cheaper lenses cannot get that bright. You got to pay a little bit more money to get to those higher level, those higher quality lenses that can do 2.8 or 1.8, 1.4, 1.2. Those smaller numbers below 3 essentially are more expensive lenses. And they are that because mechanically they have to be made in a special way to be able to have those larger openings. And of course, they'll be better quality lenses and you get more light. You always get what you pay for in photography, whether you're hiring a photographer to shoot you or you're buying a camera to shoot somebody else, you will get what you pay for. And when you get those more expensive lenses, you did get a little bit more wiggle room in that you can gather more light with a smaller f-stop number. My personal favorite lens is the 50mm f1.8. Not only is 50mm a great middle range for lenses, it's not too zoomed in, it's not too wide, it's right in the middle for me, but f1.8 is awesome. Also, this lens is only $125 when you buy it brand new, and that's awesome because that's very affordable for what it is. Very few lenses cost that much, and very few lenses that are actually affordable have f1.8. That's a great aperture to be able to shoot at when you're in a low light setting where you need to gather more light. You're shooting in the evening, you're inside, there's just not a lot of light bouncing around for you to capture. f1.8 can be your savior in those situations. Now, just like shutter speed not only controls exposure, but it also controls the motion, right? The motion blur or the sharpness. F-stop also has kind of a other side to the coin. It controls exposure, as do all these settings, but it also controls depth of field. So depth of field, I like to explain it as an invisible zone in front of your camera. Like, let's pretend your camera is a projector, right? You're looking forwards, and there is a zone in front of your camera that starts at a certain distance from your lens and stops at a certain distance. It may start 5 feet away from your camera and end 10 feet away from your camera. So you've got a 5-foot depth. That's your depth of field, and anything inside that invisible zone within that range is in focus. As you get closer and outside of that field, or behind that field, right? Because we're going forwards and backwards away from the camera in 3 dimensions, you will become out of focus, or your subject, if you have focused in those locations, they will be out of focus. Whereas anything that resides inside that zone where you've autofocused or manual focused will be sharp, depending on your depth of field. So how does f-stop affect depth of field? Well, as we shoot wider open, right, bigger hole, smaller f-stop number like f1.8, the depth of field actually gets very shallow, very thin. It may be 1 inch thick, maybe a ½ inch thick. So anything within that zone in front of your camera will be sharp, but anything beyond or in front of that zone is going to be blurry. Now, as it gets closer, it'll get even more blurry. As it goes farther back, it gets even more blurry too. So we have sharp in the middle and then forwards and backwards, blurrier from the camera's frame of reference. Now we can use that for artistic effect. It's called bokeh, when the background light sources are like these little blobby orbs, Christmas lights and city lights, very popular to have blurry orbs in the far background, whereas our subject is in focus, wherever that is, in the middle of our photo or whatever. They're sharp, they're not blurred, but the background is blurred. Or maybe something in the foreground, right in front of the subject and in front of the camera lens, maybe that's blurred, like some leaves or some artistic framing object. That's out of focus and blurry, and that's artistic, right? It's cool. We like that. It's usually done on purpose, and that's done by using the f-stop and how it controls depth of field. So as we change our f-stop to a larger value, such as f5.6, that depth of field gets deeper and deeper, which means more things can be in focus. So if I'm taking a picture of a large group of people, say a family reunion, and there's maybe 3 or 4 rows of people, there's the front row, the short people, the kids, then there's a row behind that, row behind that, row behind that. That's probably 5 feet thick of people from the front of the row to the very back row. I want them to all be in focus. So I'm not going to shoot at f1.8 because my depth of field will be so shallow that only one of those rows, the faces of those people on that row, will be in focus. But the other rows behind or in front of them will no longer be sharp. They may be a little bit soft or very blurred, depending on how close I am to them, but it's not a good result. It's not what I want. I want them to all be sharp, tack sharp, as we say. That's the goal, right? Everything tack sharp, which means every pixel is in focus and sharp. So in those cases, I would actually shoot not at f1.8 ever, but maybe f5.6 or even f7.1 so that my depth of field is deep and thick and a lot of people can fit within that zone and they can all be in focus and sharp. And that's a really good thing to understand when you're controlling your f-stop. Now, if I'm photographing just one person, it's really not that big of a deal what your depth of field is at. And generally, you want that background to be more blurred so that it's really focusing on that person. And that's actually something that really makes photos look professional and nice, is that background or foreground blur, whereas the subject, what you're focusing on, the important part of your photo, is sharp and in focus. Now, that's going to be an autofocus situation as well. You need to make sure you're using your autofocus right. You're focusing on their face or their eye, even better. And that way they are sharp, but everything outside that zone is going to be out of focus. And here's another way to increase that bokeh blur, that background blur, is to get closer to your subject. So if I'm using a 50 millimeter, which is a prime lens, it means that doesn't zoom, it's just stuck at 50 millimeters. I can't zoom in or out, it's just 50. If I want to get a blurrier background, I'm going to need to move closer to my subject, because that's another little relationship there, is distance, right? We've got f-stop and we've got distance. So as I decrease my distance, as I get closer and closer to my subject, the background is going to get blurrier and blurrier, assuming that I'm continuously focusing on their face. So if I get a full body photo of someone with, my 50 millimeter lens, and then without changing my settings, I'm still at f1.8, I get up real close and do a headshot, which is like their chest to the top of their head, the background is going to be significantly much more blurry than the full body photo, because I just cut my distance by a lot. I got much closer to them. And because of what happens when you autofocus, to close subjects versus focusing on far away subjects, that blur, that background blur will change. So controlling your f-stop is important to make sure your exposure is good, but also keep in mind how it's affecting what's in focus, your depth of field. And if you find your photos are not quite as sharp as you would like them to be, you can stop down to smaller apertures or larger f-stop numbers, depending on how you want to call it. And that will increase the sharpness and the focus. It'll ensure that your subject is more than likely landing within your focus zone, and it'll make your photos more sharp. All right, last setting to talk about in this video is the ISO. The ISO itself is an acronym from the film days. I think it stood for International Standards Organization, which was essentially a company that decided how sensitive films would be and how to rate them. Because in the film days, they had ISO also, but it was built into the film that they purchased. So you would buy ISO 400 film or ISO 1600 film. If you knew you were shooting in a dark area and you needed more, more boost to your brightness, you didn't have a lot of available light, you would buy a higher ISO film and use that. Whereas if you're shooting outside on a sunny day, you would use ISO 100 film or ISO 200 film, because you wouldn't need as much help getting enough light for a good exposure. So ISO, you don't need to know that acronym or remember it, doesn't matter these days. We're gonna conceptualize our ISO values as a left to right scale. Again, just like we did with the other settings with shutter speed and aperture, we're gonna think of left as low ISOs and darker, right, less light. And then right, as we go to the right, they're gonna be brighter and higher ISO numbers, such as 1600, 3200, 56,000. Cameras these days can get ridiculously high with the ISO numbers. I suggest, just as a loose rule, this is not, a rule for all time, but try to stay below 2000. because when you get up close to 2000, even past 1000, you will be introducing grain. So what is that? Well, here's an analogy to hopefully explain what grain is and why your photos look all pixely and grainy on the computer when you look up close to them. You know how electric guitars have a pickup on the guitar. When you play it, it generates an electric signal, sends it through that electronic, guitar cord, and plugs into an amplifier. The amplifier then takes that signal and amplifies it, obviously. But it's also amplifying any background hum or hiss or buzz that may be present in the room or in the circuits or in the guitar, and you don't really want that background noise, but you can't get rid of it because it's built into the guitar sound that's coming through the cord, and whatever comes through that cord to that amp is getting amped up to 10 or 11 if you have that. So whatever goes through that cord is the signal, and it's getting amped up to however loud you turn your gain knob on your amp. Now similarly, in the camera world, the ISO is essentially the gain of all the signal that your sensor is capturing. So your sensor doesn't just capture the light, which is I'd say 99.9 of what it is capturing. It's also capturing and generates its own electrical buzz or hum called noise. It's just something unavoidable right now with our current technology. There's always going to be a little bit of background noise present because there are electrons going through the sensor. They're bouncing around. I don't know if they're escaping or if they're bouncing off of things, but there just is some noise built into your sensor that you can't get rid of. So when you increase your ISO, you're seeing that noise more prevalently. As you go higher, you'll see it more. So if you take a photo at 100 ISO, it could have virtually, or to your perception, no noise, although it is in there. It's just not humanly perceptible. But if you take the same photo, but turn your ISO to 1600 or 3200, you're going to see some noise. And it's going to be like crunchy, grainy, sandy looking ugly pixels that distort the quality and the detail of your photo. As your ISO gets higher and as your grain and your noise gets higher in your photos, you're actually losing the perception of the details that are in focus. So we normally want to keep our ISO as low as possible without compromising the overall exposure. So when I start a photo shoot, if it's outside, I'm going to start with my ISO at 100. If I'm inside or in a dimmer, later in the evening, I might start my shoot with my ISO with 400 or 800, and then, of course, adjust from there. But my starting point is somewhere in that range. So I'll take my first test photo and I'll start adjusting my settings accordingly to get a good exposure. Now let's end the video with some really good tips here. This is how I take photos. I have kind of a system or an order of how I do my exposure settings. First, I set my shutter. Always shutter first, because with what I do, it's usually a little bit of motion involved with my subject. Whether it's candid photos at an event, or I've got kids that are not sitting totally still, or I'm just moving while I take photos. I'm kind of running around my wedding doing pictures quickly. There's some motion inherently there. So I need to always make sure that my motion is being captured sharply. So I set my shutter. You can take a picture and zoom in digitally with your camera after you've taken the picture. You review it and you can press the magnify button and zoom in as far as it'll let you zoom in to see if there is any drag or motion blur in that photo. If there is motion blur that you don't want, then let's go back and make our shutter a little bit faster, maybe 1 or 2 clicks faster. Do the same thing. Take another test photo, zoom in, and see if it's sharp or not. That's a good way to go about, fine-tuning your setting. So after I set my shutter speed, next I set my aperture, which is depth of field and blurriness, right? If I want that really juicy background blur of a bokeh, the bokeh blur behind my subject, then I'm just gonna go ahead and shoot wide open, if not at maybe f2.0. Or 2.8. If my lens limits me to that, then I'll shoot at 2.8. And once I've set that and decided, yes, this is where my depth of field is, I only got one person, so it's easy. Or hey, I've got like 35 people, I need to shoot at maybe f5.6 or something, then I do that. And then lastly, if I still need to fix my exposure and it's still too dark or too bright, then I will go to my ISO and drop that to a smaller number if it's too bright, or increase it if my photo is too dark. I need to amplify my signal, right, with a higher ISO, and that should hopefully fix my exposure. So shutter speed first, then f-stop, then ISO. Now, I did mention earlier that there are other modes on your camera that are not manual, and I call them semi-automatic or semi-manual modes. I guess a glass half full, half empty thing. And these are aperture priority and time or shutter priority. What aperture priority does is pretty cool. It actually lets you control the aperture, the f-stop, and it takes care of the other 2 settings automatically, which is ISO and shutter. So ISO and shutter are on auto, but f-stop is what you can control with your dial. And that, of course, is so you can set the depth of field and it will handle the rest of the stuff. Hopefully it does a good job. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe your photos are getting overexposed or underexposed because you're seeing, and that's kind of where you bounce back. You say, okay, I guess I should be shooting in manual. Daniel was right. I need to take control of my camera. There's the also time or shutter priority, which is cool because you can control the shutter, which is for motion blur and sharpness of motion. And then it takes care of aperture, f-stop, and ISO. Those are on auto, but your shutter is manual. Now on top of these two things, whether you're in aperture or shutter priority, you also have control over your exposure by using exposure compensation. Now this is going to look like a little left and right meter, like you can go left, which is negative, darker, or right, which is brighter. And that will say, hey camera, I know you're guessing at these other two settings in the background, but I want you to amp it up a little bit more. So it'll adjust those settings to get more light. So if you have to shoot in a semi-automatic mode, which is aperture priority or shutter priority, and you still find it's not quite hitting the mark with the exposure, it's too dark or too bright, you can use exposure compensation to add or take away brightness. And that's a nice feature to have because you still have a little bit more control over that. And you really only need to worry about one major thing, one dial instead of three. I know at first manual is a lot. It can be a headache, it can be a panic attack waiting to happen, but just take it one step at a time. Learn ways to visualize what's happening when you change this setting, or that setting. Do plenty of test photos yourself so you can start building up this kind of muscle memory and visual memory in your head of what happens to your photos when they're grainy or not, when they have a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field, when they have motion blur or no motion blur. Understanding those things visually and technically will really help you master manual and get better at taking photos, and it'll just make things more efficient and you have control over your photographs. So I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions or if I mixed up some of my terms, which I may have, you can ask me in the comments down below. But thank you for watching this and I hope it was beneficial to you. So get out there, use what you learned, and have fun.